We are kicking off our first episode of our Fight for Equality series on Project Revolution. And we are making this series so that we can highlight some of the people in our community that are making or enforcing real change and creating some amazing things. So our first guest today, we're really honored to have Mr. Tracy Siska from the Chicago Justice Project. Thank you so much for being here.
No problem. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, so moving into our first question, can you talk briefly about the Chicago Justice Project, their mission, and then your role within the organization?
Sure. So I'm the founder and executive director. I founded it back in 2007. So we're a little over 13 years old. And basically our mission is to what we call provide the fuel for change. It's all about transparency and opening data from justice agencies so we can understand what they do, understand the impact over time to their practices and policies so people can advocate for change however they want.
That's really amazing. We were really excited to see what you were doing, and we thought it was really, really interesting. So just out of curiosity, how did you develop your interest for criminal justice, or was there a specific time that motivated you to start the organization?
I've never been a big fan of abuse of power. And I basically always thought that, there's a saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I'm a strong believer in that. And I'm a strong believer in that we, as a country, misuse power all the time. And that goes from anything from a teacher or a professor to, a Cub Scout leader to a police officer and someone in the criminal justice system. And I think when I was late in college and just getting out of Loyola University, just graduating, John Burge had just been fired within the last year or two. And there was a big controversy about whether or not he had been torturing people, and the ability, it seemed to be, and there still is sadly, the question about whether it was happening. And I just thought, that needed to change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the last couple of months, we've seen a considerable overreach of power by certain parts of our government, and that cannot happen because it leads to people's individual liberties being taken away. And like that, when it gets to a point where it truly does impact certain communities, it needs to end, and people need to be like held accountable for those actions. And so, as transparency being one of the largest facets of your organization, how is the current lack of transparency affecting people here in Chicago or across the nation in general?
So there's two. Well, one thing, it disempowers them. That's the first off. It disempowers them because traditionally what's happened in America forever is there's a heater case, something we call a heater case, one that actually makes the news and gets a lot of attention. And for this generation, that was Ferguson, right? And usually what happens is the fervor around the incident, because of the media coverage originally, gets all revved up before people may or may not know all the facts. And a lot of times that's happened around cases where the facts came out completely differently than people thought. So the fervor would rise and then it would fall once the details came out, right? Because the fervor was all around an individual case rather than a pattern of what the agencies were doing. And Ferguson is still a great example, because what came out of Ferguson after the initial fervor over the shooting was that the feds came in and did a top to bottom, what's called a pattern and practice investigation. And they found out, wow, that criminal justice system is so racially biased, from the simplest thing like jaywalking through the most serious crimes and fees and all of that, was just biased top to bottom. Now, the reason communities couldn't, they knew it, they had experienced it, but they couldn't prove it systemically. And the reason they couldn't prove it was happening systemically is because they just lacked the data. They lacked the access to information that would allow them to prove it. So, with that transparency, communities are really empowered to change things.
So do you think that now, with all of the data that we've accumulated in the past, let's just say decade, that we have we have like enough information to prove that these systemic issues exist in America?
Well, that's a good question. Only a little bit. I guess my answer is only a little bit. And that is, you have to take each criminal justice system and judge it on what it's doing, because each individual justice system, for the most part, is independent of other justice systems. So, comparing and linking Chicago, New York, LA, Houston, Philadelphia, some of the top 5 largest cities, there may be things that they're doing systemically that each of those agencies is doing wrong. But I think our time and efforts are better focused on what's going on in any one of those individual justice systems. And then when you prove that's going on definitively with access to data from the entire system, you can then start to connect those systems geographically across the country. So I think there's been a great rise in the amount of data that's available. Our organization exists because we believe a lot of that is weaponized, which means they're only releasing a certain limited version that tells their story and doesn't show the whole picture. For example, State's Attorney Kim Foxx in Cook County releases about 175 tables. I think 175 fields and 5 tables. For a prosecutor's office, that's a lot. Under the law, though, they're supposed to release something like all of them, except for the identifying fields, which they have told us interaction with them is 700 tables and 7,000 fields. What are they hiding in those other 6,800 plus fields and 695 tables? Probably a lot. So yes, it's an improvement over the last regime, but good, far from it.
Absolutely.
So going into one of the specific methods and the projects that the organization is doing, we read a little bit about the Justice Media Project and the methods used to examine the media coverage of crime and violence. We found that really, really interesting. So can you talk a little bit about this specific project and how you're able to accomplish something that seems so complicated?
So we're on the way to accomplishing it. So basically we have, we started in 2011 with scraping the Trib and Sun-Times websites. And then we trained volunteers who would go in online through our portal and categorize the content by crime type, by what agency cited, and by some other factors. And then we used that, probably 40,000 articles that were categorized. We went to Chicago Hack Night and got a couple of developers, a couple of data scientists to help us greatly expand. So now, since sometime in 2016, we scrape every media site in Chicago every 2 hours. And we were able to train algorithms to automatically categorize the articles when they scrape them. When it enters the database, it's run through an algorithm and it's automatically categorized. We have another one that goes in and automatically extracts geolocation data from within the articles and then what's called geotags it. So we know exactly what community area, sometimes down to the intersection, where the incident that's being covered in the news originated. And so we're trying to work with people now. We're trying to put together a front end that will overlay the media reports with crime incident data, with data on 911 calls, which we also have, data from the prosecutor's office, which we also have, to show, to compare and contrast what's going on in the official data to what's going on in the media, and to show whether or not or how well or poorly the media is portraying crime and violence in our city.
Have you seen The 13th on Netflix?
I have not.
Okay, so it's a documentary about institutionalized racism, systemic racism, like kind of tracked throughout the years. It's an amazing documentary. I highly recommend it. But in it, it talked about how, like, throughout American history, and specifically in the last 50 years, the portrayal of African American communities has been one riddled with crime and violence, and it's disproportionate to the amount of crime that is actually going on in those communities. And so that was a piece of information that really stuck with me, because it kind of perpetuates this internalized bias that we have against certain communities in this country. And like it really is just like a fundamental part of our system, and it's really difficult to kind of like to wrap your head around that, I think.
Yeah, and if I can add, I haven't seen that, and there's definitely a disproportionate crime coverage in general has been really jacked up since the 90s. I'm sure if we were able to look, and we can't get access to that data unless you own LexisNexis, as funding for news media has plummeted since the mid 90s, and crime has started to plummet at the same time, or it started before, but in proportion. Crime coverage actually went up because it's easy and it's cheap. You don't have to do a lot of digging. There was a shooting. Go stick a microphone in the family's face. Go stick a microphone in the cop's face. Got your story. I think I would challenge that a little bit and say I think the biggest problem isn't the disproportionate coverage of crime and violence in communities of color, although that is a problem. I think the biggest issue is not tying it to systemic economic issues and votes by the city council, right? In Chicago, not tying every or many of the violent crime reports that are covered in our news media, not connecting them to the decision by Rahm Emanuel or Mayor Daley to close the mental health clinics, the decision by Rahm Emanuel to close the mental health clinic. Oh no, he closed 50 schools in communities of color, right? To not tie those together, to look at taxing and financing, which gives the mayor of Chicago like $600 million to do with whatever he or she wants, and how that is ripping money from the general funds and education. And not tying that together, to me, is the biggest problem. It allows policymakers to escape responsibility for their votes and the impact their votes have on generating the crime and violence in their communities. That, to me, is the biggest problem that we face.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is something very easily looked over simply because it's really complex and like somewhat difficult to understand. So it's not as talked about, or people just don't want to talk about it because it is like such a fundamental part of our system. But I definitely think that is something that people need to be having more conversations about. And so in just like the past couple of months, people have been having more and more conversations about law enforcement and our criminal justice system and how biased and how it's perpetuated kind of this institutionalized racism, classism, whatever. Do you think people have become generally more aware of the flaws, whether it be like on social media or in the people that you've talked to in the last couple of months? Do you think they've become more aware of the flaws in our criminal justice system? And as an expert in this field, how do you think people can learn more?
I definitely think more people are aware. Whether that awareness leads to anything, time will tell. I'm kind of an old man now. I'm getting up in the old manish category, and I've seen many a moment. The politicians and the talking heads on television. Well, we're at a moment. Well, Chicago's had many a moment. We had a case. I can't remember his name, and I'm apologizing to him and his memory and his family. I can't remember his name, but there was a case where these young kids, because they were ordered by a gang member, I think, threw a kid out of a window at CHA, and that was a moment. And the woman Pendleton, I can't remember her name either, who appeared at Obama's first inauguration, she was killed. That was a moment. All the Burgess torture victims getting off of death row, those were moments. The murder of Laquan McDonald was a moment. I'm sick of moments. I'm sick of people talking about moments. I think people are more aware. I am highly skeptical of it leading to massive change. I am highly disappointed in the Chicago mayor, who I know and I'm kind of friends with, that she didn't immediately embrace the defund the police call and to start looking at what are real alternatives, what could be done by taking money away from the police. So there is some movement in Minneapolis and a few other cities. but we'll see. You know, it's people are scared of crime and violence in this country, and we're, as Americans, we're hyper scared of everything as it is, and we don't like long-term plans. We want results immediately. So we'll see. Our new police superintendent, who was supposed to be new and different and change things, he just created 2 new citywide units in Chicago that were disbanded after the last set of citywide units went rogue and kidnapped and beat up and robbed countless people throughout the South and West Side. So, and we were told it would never happen again, and we'd never get roving units again. And here we are back to roving units. So I hope so. I hope it leads to change. I'm just skeptical it will.
So is there something, like, as just normals, everyday citizens, even students for that matter, what can we do to actually bring about some kind of change? And what is the next step for a movement like this?
Oh, wow. Most importantly, vote. Most importantly, vote for people that that represent your ideals. If it's one thing the Justice Democrats organization has proven nationwide, is there is room for people that really want to bring change. We need about 10,000 more AOCs, but we need them at every level. And that's, you know, your local city council to state rep, to state senate, to county board seats. So that's one. So vote for good people, be the good people who run. And then, you know, volunteer, get involved and volunteer for organizations that are doing good work, that represent what you want to see happen. And the other thing I would say is be highly, I don't want to say necessarily critical, but question things, question why they're done, and question, you know, question what people say they're doing, no matter what position they're in. Because there's a lot of people, especially in the criminal justice world and the helper world, especially, you know, white academics, and which I am one of. They say they're doing a lot. They claim to be doing a lot. And then as long as you don't take a close look, you'll think they are doing a lot. You gotta hold them accountable, hold them to what they say they're going to do. Everyone needs to be held accountable. And no matter who, if you make people free of accountability, no matter who they are, even if they're the greatest people in the world, they may not take advantage of it, but whoever will replace them in that position most likely will.
And so, like, in your experience, have you ever encountered a person or like a group of people that have continued to deny these systemic inequalities that you that you've seen in the criminal justice system? And if so, were you able to convince them that they do exist?
Barely. Very hard. There are the country's move away from intellectualism, both on the left and right, by the way. It is not only a conservative value. It seems to be systemic on the left too. This move away from intellectualism into expertise, and this idea that how little they're training, the average person knows the answer to every problem and question, is really scary, and it hurts the very movement they're supposedly aiming to find solutions for. This is especially true in the criminal justice system. Policies and practices within the system change because of what makes the media and the heat and the pressure and the public pressure Well, sometimes that's generated by people driven by ego or greed or power, even on the left, even in the nonprofit world. There's this jostling for power and greed and attention, even when the people have no clue what they're talking about. And it doesn't mean they're not well-intentioned for some of it, but whether they're well-intentioned or not, we have to be concerned mostly with the outcomes and what that means for people. The greatest example is domestic violence. There was a study done in Minneapolis, and they divvied up between on a response to a domestic violence incident. The officers had a pad of paper, and they're supposed to rip off, and they were supposed to tell them that the sheet they ripped off, and should tell them it's either mandatory arrest. If there's any sign of violence, someone must go to jail, or it's your discretion. And they did this big study, and this guy, I think, got on a Johnny Carson show years ago, and it went wild. It showed how successful mandatory arrest was. So the law went wild all over the country. And they went to go get, and it was called the Minneapolis experiment. Well, they tried to replicate it in the Kansas City experiment, and lo and behold, oopsies, they didn't get the same results. Although this was years after the law was implemented and going crazy all over the country. And what happened? That professor got called out. He had to go back, and he went back and interviewed a bunch of the cops in Minneapolis. They said, oh, yeah, we thought your study was stupid, so we didn't listen. We didn't listen to what we ripped off the piece of paper. We just did whatever we wanted. And what happened later when we found out in the Kansas City results was for white collar people, people who wear suits to work, if they got arrested, and which subsequently meant you made it into the news for a domestic violence incident, their level of repeating the incident plummeted because they had to worry about losing their job, their careers, and the respect they had, right? It built up. So their level of reoffending plummeted. However, blue collar workers, people who don't have to worry about necessarily if they make the paper, they're going to lose their job, their reoffending went up. Not only did it go up massively, but the level of violence in those incidents skyrocketed. That was a well-intentioned study done poorly, got press, went wild because of pressure on the media, from the media and the public to do something about domestic violence. And what in the end was happening is we were greatly increasing the number of domestic violence incident survivors and those families had to deal with, and the level of violence skyrocketed. It doesn't mean the professor had ill intentions. He was just wrong. And his wrongness led to really bad outcomes for survivors.
Wow, yeah. We never really talk about those studies that, well, at least, I mean, as like in my community or in our community, we don't talk a lot about those studies that like were incorrect and then they led to much worse outcomes than they were like initially meant to. Like the outcomes that Russ is supposed to tell. It's pretty.
Yeah, no, yeah. That's something that's common, I think, for all communities, right? I mean, we will talk about it among criminologists, but it's never like a main panel. All the studies that went bad, that were horrible, went bad and caused survivors and victims massive bad outcomes. That's not like there's no conferences heading that headline.
Right. And I think that's like one of the reasons why people are so afraid with this defund the police kind of like the saying, because like what if it does turn out badly? You know, like what happens if crime does skyrocket? And that kind of like makes people
right. And I agree, but there are ways to do it. And like people think that just means automatically close the police department and we have nothing. There are extremists in that chant that mantra, that want that. I think that's completely irresponsible. But you look at, I think it was Newark in New Jersey. I think it's Newark. They basically, what you do, I think for most people, you would stand up a separate agency. You like give the police one. You have 3 years, you're no longer going to exist. And in the 3 years, you stand up another agency that can do things. So I agree that partly it's fear driven and partly it's power and racism that's also involved in that.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think that is like, those are the kind of conversations that we need to start having in our communities as well, just to kind of like see all the sides of things and come to the most educated conclusion that we can. And this like kind of anti-intellectualism push is really detrimental to the future of this country. I completely agree. So as we look towards the future, what do you think needs to happen to achieve a more fair justice system? Whether it be in the work that you're doing with the data collection and analysis, or just legislation, etc.
I think the the first most successful thing by far would be a war on poverty, not criminalizing it, eliminating it. I think that is the biggest, would be the biggest crime reduction plan, is getting rid of poverty. And then simultaneously ratcheting up drug treatment availability, mental health treatment availability, health treatment period availability. I think all of that. And then really doing some hundreds of millions of dollars, like let's just look at Chicago, investing hundreds of millions of dollars into true economic development for the communities and the members of those communities that are currently in those communities. Economic development targeted to create an economic infrastructure within those communities. But I think solely looking at the criminal justice system for systemic change and systemic solutions is misguided. Even if the justice system did everything we wanted, those communities would still be incredibly poor. Their schools would still be incredibly bad for the most part. They still wouldn't have mental health treatment. They still wouldn't have health treatment, right? Like the police, even at their best, of the best way of defining them, are not, they don't develop any of those things. Right. So I get ostracized by criminologists when I talk about the solutions to the criminal justice system and economics rather than solutions to the justice system. But that's the truth. I mean, no matter how many officer friendlies, you could put every officer, we could make it up whoever we thought the best officer was in Chicago and clone them 13,000 times to make them the entire force. It still wouldn't make the massive change we need to see.
I think that the economic aspect of things was kind of forgotten a little bit in this movement, and everyone was so caught up on the race aspect, where there's a lot of other issues that are behind the scenes that we don't even realize a lot of times, or we don't even pay attention to.
Right. See, you wanna put a big dent into racism. Give Black and brown people economic security, economic independence, make them integrated into work environments. Wow. Let's see if the cops decide to beat up. It's not that they haven't beat up rich, poor Black and brown people. They do, just at much, much lower rates. And I think racism in the police department would change if the police department wasn't left to deal with every social ill of these communities, right? Take out mental health care, take out the schools, take out the jobs. Here, push in the police. Solve that. Won't happen.
Yeah, I mean, police officers are only trained for so much. To put that kind of burden on them, it will undoubtedly lead to like an over abuse of power, which is necessary, or I'm sorry, which is definitely not what you want in a police system governing the people. So yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so we talked about earlier, I'm so glad you brought up the point of voting, because we push that a lot. Like, a lot of people forget to pay attention to their local officials, people who they're electing, and they don't even know their names. And it's kind of a concerning thing, because we focus on this large scale, like federal government, the presidential election and things like that. And we forget people who are making a real impact on our local communities and are kind of overlooked. So that is something for sure that we want to enforce for the students hopefully watching this, as well as the adults if they're of voting age. But what can be done to help your organization, for people in normal citizens, students, adults, what can they do to help your organization?
Well, of course, we're a nonprofit, so donate is one. But short of that, volunteers. So we have, right now, we have about 55-ish interns and volunteers that are helping us. And we lose a bunch of, I think I lose like 17, 18 interns in the next few weeks. So for us, it's about research. It's about having the horsepower to do. We're doing with the American Constitutional Society, we have in the high 20s numbers of law students that are working with us right now. And we're doing research on open records laws and freedom of information laws around the country. And so we need to simultaneously, we're looking to recruit volunteers or interns or both, to simultaneously pick the top 20 or top 50 largest cities in the country and, excuse me, I'm sorry, do a scan basically of those cities and those justice systems to see what data is available both online from the entire criminal justice system. So like it would be the Houston, Dallas, Miami, all the big cities around the country. What's available around 911 calls, policing, police accountability, prosecutor data, court data, jail data, prison data. So we want to develop a tool early next year that's going to take all the legal research that my law interns are doing from the American Constitutional Society, put that together with this other level of open data research for the top 25, 50 largest cities in this country, and then build a tool that allows community members around the country to learn about what's available in their city and what the laws allow to be available and how they can use those laws to pry open data from their local criminal justice system.
Awesome. So we will definitely try and get more volunteers for you. Hopefully we'll have
awesome.
So that is about it. But again, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. We are really enlightened for sure. We didn't a lot of issues we didn't know about, and we hope that a lot of the people listening are also learning a lot about this system and hopefully can get more educated in that aspect. So yeah, again, thank you for coming, and we really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you. Let me know if you have any questions.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
All right. Have a great day.
You too.